Gideon Rose here, editor of Foreign Affairs, and welcome to another episode of Foreign Affairs Focus. We have the great privilege today of talking with Jacob Hacker, one of the co-authors of perhaps the most acclaimed and most influential work of political science in the last decade, the philosophical text behind the Occupy Wall Street and similar movements, Winner-Take-All Politics. Jacob, let's get right to it. You basically have made the case why the 1% is screwing the 99%. So explain what is behind the current surge in economic inequality.
Well, so our argument is that this really is a story about the top 1% pulling away from the rest of Americans, and that's certainly been the heart of the Occupy Wall Street critique. But I think a lot of times people who accept that the top 1% has reaped the lion's share of economic gains over the last generation nonetheless thinks that this is driven by some broad technological changes or the globalization of the economy. And we argue that while those things matter, at least as important and probably more important has been these big changes in public policy and in politics over the last generation. So we look at changes in tax policy, industrial relations policy, how labor unions are treated. We look at financial deregulation, corporate governance, executive compensation, and we basically unpack the ways in which our government has tilted in favor of the very, very well off. And then we try to answer the question of, well, how could this happen? How could this happen in a democracy where you would expect that policies that hurt the vast majority of Americans and help those at the very top wouldn't be very popular.
So economic inequality is not just real, it's a deliberately chosen societal act. Why and how could this happen in a democracy?
Well, so yeah, I mean, that's the basic argument. This is actually something that happened deliberately, not always through action. Sometimes it was deliberate inaction. A lot of the financial deregulation story is about our failure to update our policies to reflect the way in which financial markets had changed that was creating both vast rewards at the top and vast risks for the rest of Americans. But much of the book is really trying to answer the question of, how did this happen? I mean, why are tax rates so low on the very richest, much lower than they were a generation ago? Why have we seen this massive shift toward accommodating Wall Street and actually creating some of the risks that really led to the financial crisis? And why have we seen so little support for broad policies that would help the middle class or labor unions that represent workers?
And the answer is?
And the answer is, well, George Packer in his nice essay in Foreign Affairs said our answer is basically organized money. And there's two sides to that, organization and money. I think when most people talk about money, they talk about campaign finance, right? And that's a really important part of the story, but at least as important is lobbying and organization. The way in which business and Wall Street organized in the 1970s and 1980s, and in the case of Wall Street, really in the 1990s when it started to reach the pinnacle of its power and influence, say, the Clinton administration in terms of deregulating the industry and eliminating the traditional divides that were in the Glass-Steagall Act between investment and banking. When you look at that, really, it was about building an organization in Washington that would actually be able to push for the long term for big policy changes and resist efforts to update policies to reflect these changing economic realities. And one of the things that really helped for these organizations was that at the same time that they were pushing, there was these big changes taking place in our politics. And we argue that these two are very intertwined. So what were those changes? Well, Congress became much more polarized with the Republican Party moving dramatically to the right. And this was really a reflection of the degree to which the Republican Party started to get very little pushback from within its own coalition as it moved rightward and in fact was getting more and more pressure to adopt a more conservative economic line from business interests, from Wall Street, from other sources. And at the same time, the polarization was taking place. We saw the rise of the filibuster as this enormous constraint on government action. The filibuster has gone from being this very rare, procedure in the Senate used by small minorities to being basically the common rule for all legislation besides the budget. So everything besides the budget has to get 60 votes. And it's much harder to pass policies. We've seen a few hundred filibusters in just the past few years.
So if the right was doing all this, where was the left? Out to lunch?
Well, the left was divided, as you might expect, by these developments. So first of all, during this crucial period when business unites and becomes much more organized in the 1970s, Republicans figure out much more quickly how to get business money. So for a while, Democrats are just getting clobbered in terms of organization and in terms of finance. But they, of course, catch up. But they catch up in part under Tony Coelho and Rahm Emanuel and other entrepreneurs by reaching out to business and creating their own set of lobbying sort of connections. So there's a great quote in the book from Rahm Emanuel, who he says, at one point, he says, congressional campaigns they really have three parts. The first part is about money, money, money. The second part is about money, money, press. And the third part is about money, press, and votes. Now, if you've been counting, that means that money has a lot more role, according to Emanuel, than do the final votes. So money becomes much more important, and it basically cross-pressures the Democrats. And more, it's very hard for the Democrats to basically adopt a consistent line on these issues. And at the same time, on votes, they're often really fighting to keep these kind of coterie of sort of moderate members in line, especially with the Senate filibuster. And these moderates, we show in the book, are often very solicitous of these powerful economic interests, whether it's Wall Street or the healthcare industry or a whole host of other groups that are basically able to get the ear of these powerful barons in Congress.
So it seems like in the last year or so, you've started to see pushback. You've started to see change. You've started to see a sense that this is, the situation is not sustainable. Do you expect to witness a sort of progressive revival in the years to come, or are we just basically going to be living in the world you guys described?
Well, I mean, a lot of people finish our book and say they feel, if they're concerned about these trends, as I think most Americans are, they say they feel pretty depressed. We don't actually see it as a depressing story in this sense. The depressing story that we see out there is basically that we are condemned to see this rising gap between the middle and the top because of globalization and technological change, and we really can't turn back the clock. And we argue this is really about politics, and therefore it can be addressed. But at the same time, because it's about politics and because these trends have unfolded over 30 years, it's going to take a while to really address these challenges. So I think the best element of the Occupy Wall Street movement is that it's drawn attention to this gap, and it's really framed the issue in the way we do in the book, that the top 1% is pulled away from the bottom 99%. It's seen Wall Street as central to this story. But I think the longer-term challenge is to build organizations that can represent middle-class Americans on these economic issues. It's really both that there was this massive mobilization at the top and that there was this vacuum of power that for the middle that explains, I think, the winner-take-all politics that we describe in our book.
Well, follow these and other stories in the pages of Foreign Affairs. Jacob Hacker, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, Gideon.